Welcome to the 2013 Borah Symposium Plenary Session. The Borah Foundation Committee wishes to thank the Martin Institute, the Environmental Science Program, the University of Idaho Sustainability Center, the Office of Community Partnerships, the College of Agricultural and Life Sciences, the Environmental Science Program, the College of Education, and Terra Graphics for their support of this year's symposium. In addition, the Office of the President and the Borah Foundation have graciously co-sponsored a reception for symposium participants. I am Ellen Kittel, co-chair with Lisa Salisbury of this year's Borah. As such, it is my pleasure to introduce this year's plenary speaker, Alexander Wolff. For the past 30 years, a journalist of Sports Illustrated, it's worth all the work that goes into putting the symposium together. When we invite people to the Borah, we seek those who best exemplify the theme we have chosen. In this case, beyond the battlefield, sports, war, and peace. Since I do not, however, read Sports Illustrated, except during Olympic years, it behooved me to find out how his work fits into this year's theme. Bill Smith, director of the Martin Institute, who was so excited that Mr. Wolff had agreed to come that he snatched the opportunity to pick Mr. Wolff up at the airport, said, and I quote, "Sport forms part of a much larger narrative in which people play sports, sports plays upon society, and institutions at all levels of organization recognize this and use sport as an important tool to reach desired aims." Alexander Wolff was one of the first to write from this broader perspective, beginning with basketball in the Balkans and continuing through a recent cover story for Sports Illustrated titled, "Sports Saves the World." He writes as a fan, but one who takes a critical look at his subject and demonstrates the best of the journalistic tradition. Unquote. The pieces Mr. Wolff has written in the past exemplify both this more expansive perspective and this critical attitude. I think you will also find them on display in this presentation tonight. Can I have a little more light? I can't see my notes. Thank you. Over the past 30 years, Mr. Wolff's assignments have taken him to many parts of the world, some of them closed countries such as Cuba, Iran, and Maoist China. His stories chronicle those places and events where politics, culture, and sports intersect. Some of this intersection has ignited interaction with both encouraging and discouraging results. He has been there to tell the story, for example, of the breakup of Yugoslavia through the eyes of young basketball players. At today's afternoon session, Laura Thomas of Right to Play asked each person in her audience to tell the story of the person next to them what their favorite games were. Smiles broke out. Stories broke out. Sports are a familiar enough idiom that they almost painlessly encourage us to achieve not only understanding, but also change. As when Jackie Robinson forced a conversation and ultimately fundamental change on race relations. Title IX did the same for gender. And currently there has been significant movement on sports and disabilities, as our session last night exemplified. Mr. Wolff has been there to report insightfully upon and to help us understand many such critically significant stories, as he will also do tonight with his presentation, Outtakes from a Reporter's Notebook. Please join me in welcoming Alexander Wolff.
Thank you, Professor Kittel, for that warm welcome, and thank you to everybody with the Borah Committee, the Martin Institute, the university. I think all of us who are here for the symposium have been blown away by the hospitality, the frequency of the meals, attention paid to transportation in Roe, I apologize yet again for the couple of times you looked to pick me up and somebody else had already conveyed me to my next appointment. It probably seems a little bit odd to have a sports writer deliver the plenary address to a 75-year-old forum on international relations. It was once said that a sports writer is someone who can't write, who interviews people who can't speak, for people who can't read. So it's probably worth my spending a few moments telling you a little bit more about myself and why I'm plausibly before you this evening. My father's a German immigrant, my mother American, but I was raised with a little bit more awareness of a world beyond our shores than perhaps someone with two American-born parents might be. I played sports. I was a high school basketball player and wasn't good enough when I went off to college to continue to play, so I gravitated toward journalism. And after my sophomore year, still feeling I wanted to play basketball, I took a year off and kited off to Switzerland, probably the least conflict-ridden country in the world, to play a season of club basketball there at the third division level. But before I went back to college to finish up as a history major, I had been infected by that curiosity about the world and a real love of travel. The very first book I worked on was junior year in college. A buddy of mine and I threw our sneakers in the back of a car and wandered around the country looking for pickup basketball games. And like imposter anthropologists, we took notes on customs and fashions and all sorts of that. So I suppose the very first glimmers of what I would wind up doing as a journalist were there in that enterprise. And that book project, along with 3 years of stories I'd written as a campus correspondent, helped get me an entry-level fact-checking job at Sports Illustrated shortly after I graduated. It was poor-paying, long hours, no promise of any kind of writing. Mostly it was just my hide on the line if any sort of error appeared in the magazine under someone else's byline. But it was a good place to find oneself, particularly at that time. I could hustle up story ideas, and usually I found I got the green light. And plus, SI always regarded its beat as more than the main American team sports. And for the magazine, I covered a lot of basketball, but the sport has a reasonably short season. So I had many months each year when I could stick my nose in other places. And eventually I came to ask myself a variation on this question. And over my 3 decades at Sports Illustrated, sports have grown and changed in ways that perhaps weren't all that apparent to me as they were changing. You know how it is, the frog in the pot doesn't realize that the water is boiling until it's too late. But I think we've all sensed, those of us certainly of a certain age, that sports now touch on so many parts of our life, that they bleed out of the arena into adjacent subjects, which in turn then bleed back into sports. And so I found this to be a critical question, and I found myself, as Ellen recounted, writing about all sorts of things like race, gender, drugs, youth development, ethics, business, food, religion, politics, medicine. Our editors have seen fit to put on the cover stories they've asked me to do on climate change and how it affects sports, as well as fashion and style, the And One shoe and mixtape tour phenomenon. I was even able 10 years ago to teach a writing course called Writing About Sports in the Wider World, and I really wonder before globalization and before anybody could walk into a bar in a major American city at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning and find 100 other people who want to see a Euro Champions League game together here in this country. I wonder whether it would be possible really to do that. So this evening, I'd like to walk you through some of the stories I've covered in which conflict and sports were intertwined, ways in which sports can be used and are being used to try to repair the world. That German immigrant father of mine had little ability and no interest in sports. He broke his nose 3 times playing field hockey as a boy in Bavaria. My mother was a little more physically gifted, but she chose to become a pianist, who, recognizing my interest in journalism, would not so subtly try to nudge me toward a career with National Geographic. And before she died a few years ago, she was pleasantly surprised that her son could essentially write National Geographic pieces for a sports magazine, much like this one from several years ago. And for this story, I spent more than a year going around the world exploring sports and social entrepreneurship, ways that practitioners on the ground are trying to address pressing human needs. And many of you spent this morning in workshops learning about some of the non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that are doing much of this work, Fields of Growth, Soccer Without Borders, and Right to Play. And those of you who didn't have a chance to hear the other Borah Symposium attendees who led those, there are more to come tomorrow, and they'll be much more hands-on than today was. So we'll look for you over at the Kibbe Dome. We'll also tomorrow hear our keynote address from Johan Koss, who with Right to Play has helped ignite the boom in this field. But first, I'd like to lead you on a very quick tour of one of the most compelling adjacencies to sport, this movement, which has an unfortunately cumbersome name. Others have tried to use just the phrase power of sport, which is very moving but may not be quite as descriptive as this is. So I've settled on this one, awkward as it may be. It's actually not that new a movement. It's experienced this boom, but we actually have this movement in its early 19th century iteration to thank for the sport of basketball. There was this thing called muscular Christianity, where there were people who believed, as part of living a good Christian life, that it was important not just to have your spirit and your mind engaged properly, but also to have the body. And in fact, Dr. James Naismith, who invented basketball, did so believing that in the wintertime he needed some physical activity to keep mostly young men, let's face it, from getting up to no good. And in his phrase, it was actually so that they seek rest rather than mischief. But if we move forward into the 20th century, we go to Kenya, to the eastlands of Nairobi, a huge slum outside that big city. There was a Canadian environmental worker who was working there, and he was approached by some Kenyan boys and asked if he would get them a soccer ball. And he said, I will get you a soccer ball if you clean up that field where you'll want to play. So the kids cleaned up the field. He got them the soccer ball, and pretty soon, this Canadian social worker had started something called the Matare Youth Sports Association, which essentially awarded points in the standings, not just for goals scored in soccer games, but also for environmental projects, cleaning up fields, taking care of community in a positive way. And then in the mid-90s, you saw Right to Play. Johan Koss wins his medals in Lillehammer, donates his winnings to Olympic Aid, challenges others to do the same. Others are inspired to do so. Olympic Aid is languishing. Johan rides to the rescue and saves it, and then turns it into this extraordinary NGO. And Laura Thomas, the representative here today, who told us something about what they did today, will tell us a whole lot more tomorrow. And of course, Johan himself will be here keynoting tomorrow night. But as we go through some examples of this movement, I want you to know that I'm highlighting them because I find them to be just unusually great examples of a specific sport, a specific tool being applied to a very specific social need. I met a woman named Heather Cameron who had been a boxer in her native Toronto. And she'd been doing graduate work in Berlin in political science and was reading the French philosopher Michel Foucault when some words of his leaped off the page about the importance of testing limits and challenging what you think is possible. And Heather says she was inspired by those words to found something called Box Girls International in the very gritty Kreuzberg district of Berlin to help working class young women, especially those from Turkish backgrounds, develop self-reliance and confidence. The program's now since expanded to Kenya and South Africa. Now, there's a challenge in SDP. How can you get off the treadmill of writing grants and seeking sponsors for your activities? How can you fund an initiative on a sustainable basis? And what Box Girls has figured out to be self-sustaining is that over the gym in which they work out, they've established a cafe, and the girls in the program actually work the register and serve as waitresses. And they've even arranged to go to a lot of German companies and give motivational talks to women executives and women sales forces to get a little more money through the door so that they're not constantly looking for philanthropists to fund their activities. Now, what Heather said to me I thought was so interesting. She said, if they're ready to step into the ring, they've already won. And she pointed out that in these largely conservative Muslim families she works with, there's a paradox at work. Soccer, out of the question, too unfeminine. Swimming, too immodest. But the fathers, they like boxing because it's for self-defense. A great example of a sport fit for a community for a particular need. Soccer is the sport that launches 1,000 African conversations. And HIV and AIDS is the toughest subject to broach in African conversations. What a perfect cultural match of tool and task. And an NGO called Grassroots Soccer is doing wonderful work in this regard, particularly in East and Southern Africa, by folding HIV/AIDS education into the sport, much in the way that Laura demonstrated for those of us who were at the workshops this morning. What drives the epidemic, HIV epidemic in Africa? It's sexual advances of older men on younger women in the shebeens, the bars, and the townships. And how do you empower a girl to stand up for herself when she's being hit on in one of these shebeens? Grassroots Soccer, adapting something that had worked very well in Madagascar, distributed thousands of these red cards in advance of the 2010 World Cup in South Africa to help teenage girls who can be up to 8 times more likely to become infected with the virus than their male counterparts. Hand these things out. If a guy's hitting on them, they hand them out and they use sass and humor to diffuse the situation. Imagine a girl in a bar, some guy's hitting on, whips this thing out, hands it to the guy, and the whole bar sort of erupts in laughter. The guy's humiliated and the whole situation is neutralized. It's brilliant. And one of the Grassroots Soccer executives explained to me that this is the power of soccer. Soccer is their secret sauce, to use a marketing term. That it's such a powerful idiom that everyone can relate to, that you can take this little piece from the field of play and adapt it in such a positive way, and that you can actually shift social norms and thereby shift the epidemic. And one of the greatest challenges in this field is the challenge of monitoring and evaluation, and how actually to measure whether your good intentions are really getting done what they need to get done. Monitoring and evaluation, known in shorthand as M&E. And Grassroots Soccer, one of the best things they do is rigorous M&E. And the great thing is that they're showing real progress in the communities that they've worked in, are showing not just a decline in infection rates, but a wonderful concomitant increase in the willingness to talk about the epidemic. Now, last night, those of you who saw the magnificent film that Sergey did, One Goal, learned a lot about the power that empowerment and social integration for disabled people can have on social attitudes. This is another powerful example from the country of Cambodia. It's a country with 40,000 amputees, most of them the result of victims of the millions of landmines that were laid during a decade of war there. And in that country, most of these citizens had long been considered unemployable. And then along came something called the Cambodia National Volleyball League Disabled. And by working with businesses, now some 60% of the players in the league have found jobs. Most of them demobilized soldiers from both sides of the conflict. But even more notably, because this league has a real following, it's caused a sensation not unlike the soccer players on the beach that we saw in the movie last night in Sierra Leone. People flock to see it. It's really pretty interesting seeing people play sports at a high level with prostheses or the help of crutches. Because they have a sponsorship and a real fan following, these players have become minor celebrities in Cambodia, and disabled Cambodians who aren't athletes now will wear shorts to show off their prostheses because these players have made it cool. And it's one of the reasons I believe that the Paralympics and the stories behind Paralympians is one of the great growth opportunities for TV in our country. I mean, how visually compelling and inspiring were those young men last night in that movie? Another great example, tool for a task. When drug violence spilled into the hacienda of his family-run rum business in Venezuela, Alberto Vollmer confronted these gangs directly. Alberto's a former rugby player, and he recognized that gang members crave discipline, they crave a family atmosphere, every bit as much as they thrill to violence. So he conscripted gangs as intact teams into Project Alcatraz, the rugby program he founded. In the meantime, the program also offered life skills training, education, and apprenticeships, and a guarantee of a job to any participant in the program who stays straight for 3 years. Since its founding in 2003, Project Alcatraz has disarmed 7 gangs and graduated dozens of its members into society, reports a nearly 88% decrease in the regional murder rate, and Alberto Vollmer has been invited by the governments of Colombia and El Salvador to try to develop similar programs. As he told me, rugby is tough, it's confrontational, but at the same time you need self-control. They're giving us their identity, which is even better than giving us their weapons. We're not talking about people rolling a ball out here. You know, find the most misbegotten place in the world and hey, let's play ball. The most successful of these programs are ones that have been carefully thought out. And again, I submit to you, they're ones where the tool very, very precisely and intentionally matches the task. When basketball ventures into global trouble spots, it can flash a kind of diplomatic passport. In South Africa, hoops comes without racial baggage, unlike soccer, which is a largely black sport there, or rugby, which is still mostly a white sport. In Cyprus, which is a divided country between the Turkish and Greek sides, it's equally loved by citizens on both sides. In Northern Ireland, it's regarded as neither a Gaelic game by Protestants nor a game of the British garrison by Catholics, all of which helps explain the success of Peace Players International, PPI, which has spent the past decade using basketball to build bridges among young people in divided communities. You know, in the Middle East, such efforts face a challenge of another magnitude. When I was there, I did meet a 12-year-old Arab girl who lives in the West Jerusalem enclave of Beit Safafa. Her name was Ranim, and she told me she would wake up early to watch TV broadcasts involving her favorite player, a guy named Omri Kaspi, who was a Jewish Israeli who played in the NBA. And her mother had grown up despising Maccabi Tel Aviv, Kaspi's old club, and its yellow and blue, because that club had represented the Jewish occupiers. But she caught me by surprise. She told me that my daughter feels Kaspi represents her because she knows he comes from the same part of the world. And it was hard not to hear a mother say that about her daughter and not feel that there was some commonality in that sense of place that might be the germ of a solution in a conflict that seems to be the world's most intractable. Now, basketball does have an unusually ecumenical quality, perhaps because it was taken all over the world in the late 1800s by YMCA missionaries who happened to be trained at that school in Springfield, Massachusetts, where Dr. Naismith invented it. And that's one of the reasons I felt I could pursue a book project that involved going around the globe, taking the measure of the sport at the end of the 20th century. And that approach, using sport as a lens through which to look at the world, had been tried in other sports. That opening quote, the one about what do they know of cricket, those who only cricket know, is from C.L.R. James, a West Indian social critic. And it comes from his book Beyond a Boundary, which uses cricket as that lens. There's a European journalist named Simon Cooper who wrote a path-breaking book during the early 90s with soccer at its core called Football Against the Enemy. There's a Canadian rock musician turned writer named Dave Bedini. He used to play in a band called the Rio Statics, and he found ice hockey in surprising places for his book Tropic of Hockey. I hope some of you are writing these down because they're good reads all. The approach even has found a place in academia, too, with conferences like the University of Iowa's recurring gatherings on sport and cultural distinctiveness, encouraging scholars to take this type of analysis seriously. But it had never really been tried with basketball, at least not at book length. And I felt in the aftermath of the 1992 Olympics in Barcelona with the impact of the dream team still rippling outward, and Michael Jordan having just decided to retire for good, that the time was ripe. So I went around the US and through another 17 countries asking myself, what can the world tell us about basketball, and what can basketball tell us about the world? And perhaps the most beguiling and heartbreaking place I visited was the former Yugoslavia. I got my first major dose of Balkan basketball at the 1991 European Championships in Rome. A united Yugoslavia sent a wonderful team there, the nucleus of its defending 1990 world champions, which featured players we'd come to know here in the US as NBA stars, Vlade Divac, Toni Kukoc, and Dino Radja. Alas, back home, civil war was brewing. In 1991, separatist politicians were driving wedges between Serbs and Croats, and Bosnian Muslims, and even Slovenes. And this gentleman, Juri Zdovc, a guard from Slovenia, had been a starter on those teams, instrumental in leading the Yugoslavs to the championship game in Rome in 1991. But on the eve of the final, he received a cable at the team hotel from the Slovenian Minister of Sport, telling him not to play, that if he did play, he'd be considered a traitor to his country. He was distraught, but he had a young family back in Ljubljana, the capital. The Sports Illustrated photographer in Rome with me, Heinz Klutmeier, and I ran back to the hotel when we heard about this news, and Heinz shot a picture of Juri Zdovc in tears, being comforted by Serb, Croat, and Bosnian teammates alike. Yet within a few years, Juri Zdovc would be telling anyone who'd listen that it had been his own decision not to play in that final in Rome, and he was proud to have made it. And it was my first exposure to how war and politics could seize people, even sometimes disfigure their memories. Before the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta, I asked my editors if I could pursue this story at greater length. I'd watched Yugoslav teams play soccer, play volleyball, play water polo. If it were a team game, multi-ethnic groups of Yugoslavs excelled at it. They didn't just succeed in spite of their ethnic differences, but almost because of them, as if they drew strength from the breadth of traits brought to the team. Yet simple existence alongside one another now seemed to elude them. I chose to focus on that remarkable generation of young Yugoslavs who had not only won that 91 European title, but 4 years earlier, when they had been innocents, just 17 and 18 years old, had twice defeated a U.S. team coached by Larry Brown to win the 1987 World Junior Championships. I chased down in the U.S. Kukoc and Radja and Divac, all now in the NBA, as well as a couple of other members of that team who played now for club teams in Europe, Croats, Serbs, and Bosnian Muslims, to find out how the Balkan War of 91 to 95 had shaken their friendships and recast their accomplishments. What had happened, in short, after they had had to console Juri Zdovc that day in Rome. I brought along two friends, Steve James and Peter Gilbert, the filmmakers who had made the widely acclaimed documentary Hoop Dreams. I wrote the story for the magazine, and Steve and Peter told it in these 9 minutes with film and sound, and Kai's going to cue it up for us now.
The Olympics have always been a window onto the larger world around us, and sometimes that window looks out on tragedy. The Yugoslav basketball team, like the nation it represented, drew strength from its differences. Serbs, Croats, Muslims, winning championships for a united Yugoslavia. But the ancient hatred seething beneath the national surface finally boiled over, destroying the country, destroying the team. Sports Illustrated senior writer Alex Wolff and Steve James and Peter Gilbert, the makers of Hoop Dreams, bring us that story.
This is my Yugoslavian team when we were all together. This is a Serb, this is a guy from Vojvodina, guy from Slovenia that played for Bosnia, Muslim, me. This is a Croat, Kukoc. This is a Bosnian Serb. This is a Serbian Serb. Montenegrin, Serb, Croat, Muslim, Serb. We were all like brothers. It's incredible. We really acted like big family.
The refugees from Yugoslavia's 1987 World Junior Champions have come to Atlanta from around the world. The Bulls' Toni Kukoc and the Celtics' Dino Radja will play for Croatia. Vlade Divac will play for Yugoslavia, as will fellow Serb Saša Đorđević. Teo Alibegovic, a Bosnian Muslim from Slovenia, will be watching at home with coach Svetislav Pesic. 9 years ago, they were together. As teenagers, they twice stunned a favored American team to win the World Junior Championships, demonstrating the wonderful things that can happen when you take a group of Yugoslavs and hand them a ball.
Wir sind eine talentierte Nation für Mannschaftssportarten. Für Mannschaftssportarten, man braucht Mannschaftsgeist und zusammen.
We used to dream in each other's houses when we were kids. They used to come over to my place. I used to come over to their place.
And you always remember those days like happy days, because you don't have a problem of a wife and kids. You don't have a problem of your car broke down because you don't have one.
I think I was around 16 or 17 years old when we first met each other, and from that time, almost every summer, we were together.
To prepare for the '87 Junior Worlds, Coach Pesic had his players run wind sprints up the Olympic ski jump near Sarajevo. He fostered togetherness by having competitors for starting positions on the team room together.
So the guy that you were supposed to hate the most, you had to share the room with for 3 months of preparations. So I was in the room with Kukoc, Radja was in the room with Divac, and we became so close that you could not split us. We all wanted to have fun. So we did all possible to have it, you know.
We used to steal the tapes from the coaches and watch it all night long until 6 in the morning, like the NBA highlights or NBA games, All-Star games.
With Magic Larry, after that Michael, Isaiah.
Just watch the TV, drinking, eating, you know, having fun.
But also we did, you know, a very good job. We won the championship, and after that it was, unbelievable feeling.
For the next 4 years, this generation of Yugoslavs dominated international basketball.
We accomplished, everything. Junior European Championship, World Cup a couple times, many senior European championships. We had everything except the gold from Olympics. If one team can beat the dream team, it would be our team. We never got the chance.
Civil war struck Yugoslavia in 1991. Bombs reduced that ski jump in Sarajevo to rubble. The conflict split the nation along ethnic lines, divided the team, and destroyed the players' dream.
You cannot have the same relationship like you had before. You can't. That's the way it is, because a lot of people have been hurt by this war, badly hurt.
We all were just lost lambs. We didn't know the truth. The same picture you see on Croatian TV and on Serbian TV with a different announce.
It's hard once you see 19, 20 years old without the legs, without the arms. It's you don't think about basketball.
At the 1995 European Championships, the poison of the war spilled out onto the court. Đorđević and Divac now played for Serbia and Yugoslavia. Kukoc and Radja played for independent Croatia. Yugoslavia won the title and Croatia came in third. Both teams qualified for the Olympics in a possible meeting in Atlanta, but the awards ceremony was a disaster.
Unbelievable. The Croatians have walked off the podium. These players played together as a unit. And Croatia turned their backs on Yugoslavia in their golden moment.
I was pissed off. They were not thinking with their heads. They were thinking with the heads of their politicians.
They were insulting us. saying bad things about your family.
Once they started with their national anthem, we went out.
I understand that was a political thing and everything. It's fine. It's against my country, and I understand that. But it was also a personal thing against me. It hurt me a lot.
If I have to do it again, I'll do it again.
Dass diese Welt insgesamt verrückt geworden ist.
1 year later and thousands of miles away, the former teammates still can't escape the war.
They expect for me to be, to represent the Croatia. If somebody sees me with him, like drink, having a good time, and I go back home, they will kill me. They said, it's not the right things to do to them.
You just pushed not to do the things you would like to do. Like being as close friends as you want to. Because what Tony said, back home, you are in deep trouble.
Once we were together and we had a great time, but that's a past for me. Gotta move on.
To build one friendship, you need years and years. To break that friendship, you need just a second. And that's what happened to us. I have everything, you know. I have a nice life here. I have a great career. I have a wonderful marriage. I have 2 sons. I have everything that makes people happy. But I'm not happy because of the situation in my country.
Wenn ich diese Bild gucke, sehe und wenn ich jetzt über Krieg etwas sagen will, dann ich fühle mich, weiß ich nicht, ich fühle mich enttäuscht, ich fühle mich traurig, was alles mit unserer Jugoslawien passiert.
This was one of the biggest joys of our young lives. It's like first love. There's nothing you can forget about it. One day I'm gonna tell my kids, don't you ever hate someone because he's something. He's that nationality or that race. Yugoslavia with Slovenians, Croats, Serbs, Muslims, Bosnians, the Montenegrins, Macedonians. That was a very good country to live in.
I don't know about you, but every time I see Vlade Divac's his face when he snaps his fingers, talking about how easy it is to lose a friendship, I get very moved. There was a wonderful 30 for 30 that ESPN did that Vlade narrated about his relationship with a Croat named Dražen Petrovic. It was called Once Brothers. You can get it on Netflix if you didn't have a chance to see it. It's well worth seeing, mostly because Vlade gave so much of his heart and narrates it in that same very, very effective way. And that's actually where I realized that print is very limited, that when I see a little clip like that, just how powerful it can be, I sometimes wish that maybe I were carrying, like Sergei carrying a camera around. But I'm often asked where story ideas come from, and the seed for the story you just saw, both the SI story and the film we watched, was planted by this man. You probably recognize him from the film. He's the coach, Svetislav Pesic. And 4 years after those 91 Europeans were played in Rome on the eve of the Balkan War, European national teams gathered again, this time in Athens for the 95 Euro, and as you saw in the film, Serbia and Croatia now sent separate national teams. And after that medal ceremony debacle where the Croats walked off, I found Coach Pesic in the lobby of the Athens Hilton. If you thought he was agitated in the film by what had happened, he was even more upset at seeing his boys carried off by the nationalist tide. And for several hours there in the lobby, he unburdened his feelings to me. And I felt with him as I would with Kukoc and Divac and Raja when I would find them back in the US, almost that I was serving the role of therapist for him. He needed to unburden himself to me. And he more or less said that if you go back and talk to the guys, please tell them I say hello. Ask them how they're doing. As if I could be a kind of social secretary for this club that had been torn apart. And I knew then that I had to tell the story of the team. So let me tell you a little bit more about Pesic. He counts Sarajevo as his home. He's an ethnic Serb, but he's married to a woman who's a Croat. And he'd been a star player in Sarajevo for the club team there, Bosna Sarajevo. And that team had won with him starting the 1979 European Cup, with a team, of course, that had Serbs and Croats and Muslims, as well as a coach from Montenegro. And to welcome them home, 10,000 Sarajevans had lined the road from the airport when they came back with that trophy, the same road that would come to be known during the war as Sniper's Alley. And in 1998, 2 years after we told that story and filmed Pesic, when I was working on my global basketball book, I flew to Sarajevo. I wanted to know how the game had survived during the conflict there and what the game had meant to people there, and found to my surprise that attendance at games had actually spiked during the siege, the longest siege in human history, because people were so desperate to see one another, to take inventory on who was still alive, that they overrode all their fears. At the time of my visit, an uneasy truce was then into its 4th year, but the city still bore all those scars that you saw in the film: crumbled buildings, holes on the sidewalk from shells and bullets. Every spare patch of grass turned into service as a cemetery. And disembarking the flight, a remarkable thing happened. I ran into Coach Pesic in the passport line. It turned out that he was making, just then, his first trip back to Sarajevo since the war. He told me there at the airport about his old club team's historic victory. It was Yugoslavia's first international basketball title ever, he said. We came home with it on April 6th, 1979. On April 6th, 1941, the Nazis invaded Yugoslavia. On April 6th, 1992, the war in Bosnia began. In the Balkans, I was left to think, people certainly know their history. We made our way from the baggage claim to the curb, and Pesic introduced me to a friend of his named Mirsad, who drove a minibus and arranged for Mirsad to take me into town. I climbed in, and I watched Pesic drive off. He was hunched over a little rental car, trying to pick his way through a new parking lot that was cleared of mines and onto a completely reconfigured access road. He tried what must have been an old exit, only to find it barricaded by peacekeeping troops. So he turned around and headed off to try to find another one. And it was heartbreaking to watch all this, to see a man whose heart was still bound up in Sarajevo and all that that city stood for, to see him come home and find himself lost before he had even left the airport. Sport has been called war by other means, and no sport is more susceptible to this kind of abuse than soccer. Its universal popularity, the passions it can unleash, ensures that it will always have a preeminent power. And there really was a soccer war in 1969. It broke out in July of that year around qualifiers for the following summer's World Cup. Tensions had mounted between Honduras and El Salvador. There was terrible overcrowding in El Salvador, not enough land for people to make a living off of. And there were border clashes, Salvadorans trying to go into Honduras to make a living. And then there were incidents at the soccer matches that were going on that inflamed those passions, and then the press ginned everything up a little bit more. Pretty soon, Salvadoran military planes were bombing the airport in Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras. And the war lasted for most of a week, and a couple thousand people ended up losing their lives. Soccer wasn't at the root of the conflict, but the sport definitely lit the fuse. And when some cultural force exerts itself across borders, like art or music or sport, or food even, we call it soft power. Okay, so how can soft power be deployed to promote peace rather than provoke violence? The man on the left there is Tom Friedman, the New York Times columnist, who's written extensively about foreign affairs, and particularly about soft power and American influence of soft power and how it can affect the world. And he seems to be someone who believes that it has a real capacity for good. And he's developed this thing he calls the Golden Arches theory of conflict prevention. It basically posits that no two countries with at least one McDonald's franchise have fought a war since each opened its McDonald's. As he has written, quote, "When a country has a middle class big enough to support a McDonald's, it becomes a McDonald's country, and people in McDonald's countries don't like to fight wars." As I worked on my book, I tested a theory of my own. No two countries with at least one citizen in the NBA had waged a war since its citizen joined the NBA. Now, you'll recall that NATO, at long last, mounted an aerial bombardment against the Serbs to try to bring an end to the Yugoslav conflict. And 4 days into the NATO bombing of Belgrade, players were working out at Pionir, which is the home gym of Red Star, the big Belgrade basketball club. Air raid sirens began to sound during a game of 3-on-3, and most of the players scattered, but there was one, a guy named Milenko Topic, a member of the national team, who stayed and actually said, "Pionir is the safest place in town. NATO knows it's full of NBA prospects." Indeed, he was speaking the truth. At the time of the Balkan War, 160 Yugoslavs played beyond the borders of that country, most of them for club teams in NATO member states. The average Yugoslav followed their progress and felt real pride that they could succeed in the wider world. Slobodan Milosevic's attempt to dragoon Serbia back into the past to fight some ancient tribal conflict was completely at odds with the modern integrationist impulses of young middle-class Serbs, and their attitudes helped ensure that that bombing didn't need to last long before it did bring Milosevic to heel. But aha, there is a McDonald's in Belgrade. So is my theory facile and simplistic? Well, yes, it is, but no more so than Mr. Friedman's McDonald's theory. In fact, the Balkan War did disprove both theories, as there was indeed this one at the time hostilities broke out. Anti-American demonstrators actually smashed its windows in reaction to the NATO bombing, forcing it at least temporarily to close. But I'd argue that the "I love this game" theory is more durable than the McDonald's theory, because the Golden Arches are seen as a sign of American cultural imperialism as much as of soft power. They count all the people who have rioted against McDonald's over the years: French farmers, British environmentalists, Chinese students. They've all done it. Basketball, by contrast, took root around the world long before McDonald's. Ray Kroc ever sold his first hamburger. So years later, when the NBA began to export its version of the game, the league had come to be regarded less as a force of cultural imperialism than as a really elite version of something that was essentially familiar. The NBA may be a really slick business, even a rapacious one, but no one has ever rioted against it. It's seen rather as a pageant of human striving in which anyone might partake: Yao Ming, a Dirk Nowitzki, a Nene Hilaria. So how have sports actually influenced the world for the better? To me, the most powerful example is the truly extraordinary transformation of South Africa over the past 40 years. And on Robben Island, imprisoned members of the African National Congress created their own soccer league with bylaws, referees, and administrators. And from his solitary cell, Nelson Mandela realized that through their Makana Football Association, they were learning self-governance and conflict resolution, and could one day be counted on to take seriously the obligations of democracy. Since the fall of apartheid, former Makana Football Association players, referees, and officials have served South Africa as President, Defense Minister, Minister for Safety and Security, Deputy Chief Justice, and Sports Minister, as well as provincial premiers and members of Parliament. The story is told in another wonderful book you may want to jot down the title of, called More Than Just a Game. And during the apartheid era, rugby, cricket, and tennis were enormously popular among the ruling whites, but the country's status as a pariah state left South Africa unwelcome in international competition. So pressure from the outside, in the form of that international sports boycott, hastened the end of white minority rule. And a side note, actually, about that boycott. Johann Olaf Koss counts as a mentor of his and a friend, a professor at the University of Toronto named Bruce Kidd. He's a former Canadian Olympic runner and was a very prominent figure in this movement. And he's told me that today's sport for development and peace movement is largely the result of anti-apartheid activists in the developed world seeing their dream of a multiracial South Africa coming true, asking their allies back in Africa on the continent, okay, what do you need from us now? And this is what they said: we need your help to develop us through sport. Okay, Morgan Freeman, Matt Damon, right? I'm assuming, given the audience here, that most of you recognize the allusion to Invictus, the movie. I probably don't have to go into detail about how Nelson Mandela used sport to reassure the white minority and unify that fledgling nation. He made sure to retain the honor the rugby team's Springbok name and mascot, understanding how important those symbols were to Afrikaners. And thanks to his friendship with Francois Pienaar, who was the captain, and of course the country's astonishing home field win in 1995 when they hosted the World Rugby Cup, showed that a multiracial South Africa could be a stronger South Africa. I had the good fortune to meet Francois Pienaar in London for the Olympics, and he told me that when he first met Mandela, they spent their first hour together speaking about sport in Afrikaans. Mandela was fluent in Afrikaans. The team manager of that rugby team said the very game that had kept us apart for so long, Madiba, the nickname for Mandela, he used it to unite the country. Thus, let's take inventory of those last 3 slides. South Africa today owes its existence as a functioning multiracial democracy partly to the braiding together of 2 epic sports stories, one from a largely black sport, soccer, and the other from a historically white one, rugby. And considering that sport, through the international boycott, helped do away with apartheid to begin with, not a bad showing for a few decades' worth of work in one small corner of the globe. In 1994, the US hosted soccer's World Cup for the first time. In advance of the event, I picked up an assignment to cover a huge World Cup qualifier between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland to be played in fiercely Protestant neighborhood of Belfast. You know, pilots on approach to Belfast airport sometimes tell passengers to reset their watches to the local time, 1690. Now, my pilot hadn't said this, but I'd heard the story nevertheless, and it had me wondering about the cabbie who was taking me into town, a man who wanted to know why I'd come to Northern Ireland. Soccer game, I told him. Not a seat to be had, he replied. The Republic of Ireland was playing the North, and the Republic needed a win or a tie to qualify for the World Cup in the US the following summer. The North was out of the running no matter what. The 2 sides were playing in Ulster, which was still mourning its dead from the bloodiest month in decades. 27 lives, Catholic and Protestant, lost in October. Most of them in Belfast, including 10 right there, where a fish shop once stood until an IRA bomb took it out. People understatedly called the murderous conflict the Troubles. They saddened me greatly, my cab driver said. These people causing the Troubles, they're not real Irish. They don't have the Gaelic soul. Me, I have no enemies. People may not like me, but I have no enemies. I began to form the question in my head. Not that it matters, but are you? The answer came before I could ask. I grew up on the Shankill Road, where all was red, white, and blue, orange to the core, he said, indicating with codes of color in place that he was a Protestant. But if the Republic should go to the Cup finals, I, for one, won't have a tear in the eye. They're Irish, and I'd wish them well. My driver's name, I came to find out, was Archie Cunningham, and with sport and politics, I had broached subjects entangled with much of his life. Luckily, it was a long ride to the hotel, long enough to accommodate all the stories tumbling now into the back seat. How Archie Cunningham had been a crack cyclist once, good enough to win the Tour of Ireland. How he had carried the tricolored flag of the Republic at the 1972 Olympics for a united Irish team, only to receive threats from hardliners in the Shankill after he returned home. How fierce Protestant Unionists had phoned him at home a few years later on the eve of a St. Patrick's Day race in the South, warning him off competing in it. He went anyway and won the thing. If I hadn't gone, if I'd allowed myself to be dictated to, I'd have been bothered with calls every night, he told me. The Irish need only minutes to make friends and strangers, I thought. Why do they require centuries to do the same of one another? I found myself posing this question again and again during my visit to Belfast. I met John Sugden, a professor of education at the University of Ulster, who co-founded Belfast United, a mixed-faith soccer team that toured the U.S. every summer. And he explained that in international rugby and boxing, there were all-Ireland teams, encompassing the Catholic South and the Protestant North, which even today is still part of the United Kingdom. Even to that most nationalistic of athletic gatherings, the Olympics, Ireland sent simple Irishmen and Irish women, people from the North and South, Protestant and Catholic, people like Archie Cunningham. Why is soccer different? I asked John Sugden. It's a working-class game, he said, and most of the troubles are in working-class areas. So talk of a united team really gets the hackles raised. And the mood at Windsor Park, where Northern Ireland played that qualifier with the Republic, was openly sectarian. Windsor Park is set among red brick row houses of a unionist stronghold in South Belfast. The stadium is home to Linfield, a soccer club that suited up its first Catholic player only a year earlier, largely because of pressure from commercial sponsors. In 1991, a terrorist grenade exploded at one end of the stadium among supporters of Cliftonville, a Catholic team. While the Irish Republican Army and its unionist counterparts tended to spare sport, the inflammations that the terrorists from both sides caused were undressed sores, and soccer games with sectarian implications routinely reinfected those wounds. Even as they cheered a Northern Ireland team composed of players from both faiths, Protestant fans sang such songs as "The Sash My Father Wore," with its lyrics about being up to our knees in Fenian blood, Catholic blood. I was a half mile from the stadium when a policeman stopped me, demanding to see my ticket. A quarter mile from the grounds, I saw graffiti celebrating the Ulster freedom fighters, the Protestant paramilitary that strafed a pub in the predominantly Catholic village of Greysteel only a few weeks before my visit on Halloween night, the gunman yelling "trick or treat" before killing 7 people. There were sectarian songs, monkey sounds directed at a Republic defender who was part black, and shouts of "You Fenian bastard" at the referee after he made a call that favored the Republic. The game ended in a 1-1 draw, a result that assured that the Republic would go to the States in June. Upon leaving the stadium, I could hear the singing of a few of the Republic's fans still inside, cordoned by security guards, and finally unable to unbottle their emotions as they waited to be escorted from the grounds. A man walking next to me was enraged. "Listen to the scum in there," he snarled, singing, "Someone should machine gun 'em, trick or treat, bastards." The next morning, Archie tried to help me make sense of what I'd seen. "Last night, for the people there, it was war without guns," he told me. "But the result? It was an Irish dream. Nobody lost, and the Republic went through. For a pure Irishman, it couldn't have worked out any better." It happens strikingly often that I'm out on one assignment and stumble across the seed of another assignment, and so it was with that trip to Belfast. I heard so many tales about soccer and how it had bewitched the Republic of Ireland that I jawboned my bosses into letting me go back to tell that story as part of our World Cup preview coverage. So in the spring of '94, they sent me back to Europe, and I found myself riding an Irish fan bus from Amsterdam to Tilburg for a friendly between the Netherlands and the Republic. Years ago, the Irish had encountered an unwelcome propagator of the game of soccer, the occupying British soldier, who to Irish Catholics represented subjugation by England and English culture going back to the 17th century. The Gaelic Athletic Association had been founded in 1884 to further games of Gaelic origin, like hurling and Gaelic football. And it pledged itself to making indigenous sport as much a part of the Irish nationalist movement as music and language. But the GAA went further than that. It instituted the ban, which barred from Gaelic games anyone who played or even attended games of the British garrison, such as soccer, rugby, and cricket. And so soccer languished in the Republic for more than 80 years. The national team suffered through a string of mediocre managers, bad luck, and only about 25 years ago did attitudes begin to shift. The Republic failed to qualify for the 1970 World Cup in Mexico, but by then more and more Irish could afford TV sets, and with the altitude of Mexico City livening up the ball, a bunch of goals made for beguiling soccer on the home screen. And 1 year later, a Dublin newspaper published on its front page a picture of Mick O'Connell, perhaps the greatest Gaelic football player of all time, watching a soccer match. O'Connell retired before the Gaelic Athletic Association could launch an investigation, but the GAA, facing reality, abolished the ban within a year. And in the North, even those shock troops of republicanism, the provisional IRA and the official IRA, the Provos and the Sticks, even they were known to play soccer against each other. Still, in some quarters, the ban mentality continued. In 1993, the GAA had expelled a Gaelic club in County Wicklow for having permitted a local six-a-side soccer team to use its facilities. In another incident in Wicklow, the GAA withheld its support from a community center until a modest soccer program, a once-a-week, 1-hour class for kids under 10 years old, was eliminated. The national team still had to play its home games at Lansdowne Road, a 42,000-seat stadium, instead of 85,000-seat Croke Park, the Gaelic ground. Even though such foreign games as Australian rules football had been played in Croke Park, a soccer ball had never rolled across its sacred turf. Not 25 years before that, an Irishman had to forswear soccer to prove his Irishness, and now, as the country took its place in the European community, the game had become a screen on which Irish people everywhere could project their nomadic sense of nationhood. An unusually young population in particular yearned to take its place in a united Europe. After all, you cannot beat Holland in hurling or Germany in Gaelic. I'd heard many of those old soccer stories and Gaelic stories from my fellow passengers on that bus to the match. And one of them, a shopkeeper named John, told me of his childhood in County Donegal, where he got caught playing soccer in a schoolyard, only to have the schoolmaster take a knife and slash the ball to bits as John watched. The ban would still be here if it were up to the GAA, he told me. But John believed that the lads, as everyone called Ireland's national team, and the fans of the lads, uncommonly well-behaved even when drunk, had as much of a point to make today as the GAA did in another more oppressive time. The exploits we make and the happiness we display wherever we go, in a way it is political, he told me. It allows people in England especially to see we're not all murderers. To hear John from County Donegal tell it, a soccer fan can be a political actor. Now wait a minute, aren't political actors supposed to be presidents and premiers and diplomats with portfolio? To test this question, the U.S. table tennis team's visit to China in 1971 bears a closer look. Certainly it was a diplomatic coup. Ping-pong diplomacy ended the People's Republic of China's 22 years of self-imposed isolation from the West and set in motion a chain of events that culminated in the Beijing Olympics. History books place Mao and Richard Nixon at the center of this chapter of history. In fact, the two men who catalyzed that trip weren't Nixon and Mao, nor were they Henry Kissinger or Zhou Enlai. Ping-pong diplomacy took place largely because of these two men. In advance of the 2008 Olympics, I set out to tell a story that turned out to be one to which the great man theory did not apply. Instead, circumstances elevated two ordinary men from the basement rec room of history. That's Glenn Cowan, the shaggy-haired one on the right, and Zhuang Zedong in the Mao jacket on the left. Before Nixon could go to China, Cowan first had to get on a bus, and Zhuang had to get up from his seat on that bus to greet him. So here's the story. April 4th, 1971. We're at the World Table Tennis Championships in Japan, Nagoya, Japan. And Cowan is a member of the U.S. team. He just emerged from a practice venue, and he was hoping to catch a ride to the main stadium. He flagged down a shuttle bus bearing the tournament logo, and climbing aboard, found it filled with the Chinese team, which as a condition of its participation had been promised exclusive lodging and transportation. From Cowan's hair and floppy hat, the passengers knew that they had an exotic interloper in their midst, even before spotting the USA on the back of his warm-up jacket. Cowan was 19 at the time, leaned against the closed door of the bus for lack of a seat, and facing the mute stares of his fellow passengers, broke the silence. "I know my hat and hairstyle and clothes look funny to you, but in the US, lots of people look like this." Zhuang Zhedong, then a 30-year-old, three-time world singles champion, watched from the back of the bus, listening to an interpreter's translation as the American held forth to no response. After a half-dozen years' absence from international competition, the Chinese had agreed to send their table tennis players to Japan in what they called the spirit of friendship first, competition second. Yet on orders from Mao, they weren't to pose for photos, exchange flags, or initiate conversation with Americans. Indeed, Mao had once said, "Regard a ping-pong ball as the head of your capitalist enemy. Hit it with your socialist paddle, and you have won the point for your country." As Zhuang would say years later, at that time we were still in the Cultural Revolution. Any exchange with Westerners would be attacked with vicious labels such as treason or spy. So when this American guy got on the bus, nobody dared talk to him. Yet in the awkward space of those moments, Zhuang felt himself torn. What of the charge to the team to put friendship first? What of the core teaching of Confucianism in which he had been raised, which holds nothing more precious than harmony? For all Zhuang knew, this American had boarded the bus to offer a greeting, and as the team's most accomplished player, the Chinese star felt a particular responsibility to reply in graceful kind. "I was thinking, China has been well known as a country of hospitality for more than 5,000 years, he would say. If everyone ignores that American athlete, it would be ironic. Then I looked at him and thought, he's not involved in issuing policy. He's just an athlete, an ordinary citizen." Zhuang stood up and started up the aisle toward Cowan. His teammates urged him to stop, and one even tugged at his shirt to restrain him. But through that interpreter, he began a conversation. Even now, Zhuang said before his death only 6 weeks ago, "I can't forget the naive smile on his face." Zhuang decided to give Cowan a gift. At that time, China was poor, he would later explain. We had nothing much but very small things, such as traditional wooden fans, emblems, with Chairman Mao's portrait, and silk handkerchiefs. Zhuang regarded these all as inadequate. "Since he is an American athlete, I thought I should give him a bigger present." And he pulled from a bag a brocaded tapestry woven in the silk-producing city of Hangzhou. By now, the bus had reached the venue, where photographers captured the two smiling athletes disembarking, Cowan with a brocade and Zhuang at his side. The next day, several Japanese newspapers ran front page pictures, and the Associated Press and Agence France Presse picked up the story. As a result, Zhuang was upbraided by the deputy of the Chinese delegation. "Well, Chairman Mao told us we should differentiate between American policymakers and common people," Zhuang protested. "What was wrong with my action?" Meanwhile, at an underground mall, Cowan had found a T-shirt that fused an American flag with a peace symbol above the words, "Let it be." At the stadium, Cowan embraced Zhuang and gave him the T-shirt. As I reported this story, I came across a Chinese history of ping-pong diplomacy and arranged to have it translated. According to this book, which is called The Little Ball Moves the Big Ball, Behind Ping-Pong Diplomacy, which was written by a journalist for the People's Daily, Cowan then dragged Zhuang in front of a TV camera. Asked if he'd like to visit China, Cowan replied that he would, touching off another day's worth of news stories. And a day later, back in Beijing, Mao took some briefing papers with him to bed. After popping his usual sleeping pills, he came upon press accounts of the encounters between Zhuang and Cowan. According to Mao's nurse, Wu Shuzhun, upon seeing photos of the two table tennis players exchanging gifts, Mao was moved to exclaim, "My lord, Zhuang!" And he told Wu that the American team should indeed be invited. So I talk about the great man, or perhaps not so great man or woman theory. Mao's secretary, a woman, was deeply involved in this story too. One hurdle remained. Mao had ordered his nurse to disregard any directive he issued after he had taken sleeping pills. Seeing her hesitation, he insisted that his instructions should nonetheless be carried out. After Wu pressed him again to reassure her that he had really changed his mind, Mao kept himself awake until Wu returned with word that she had indeed telephoned the foreign ministry with his order to formally invite the U.S. team. Mao told Wu he had invited the American team in recognition of the inevitable. Quote, "The friendly Sino-American relationship is definitely the trend. Look, the encounter between Zhuang and Cowan is so natural. They bear no grudge against each other. Even though there was some hesitation, this was caused by history." After spending much of his life suffering from a bipolar disorder, Glenn Cowan died of a heart attack at age 52. Honestly, how many people in this room could have produced his name before tonight? Despite those 3 world singles titles, Zhuang Zedong had been jailed during the Cultural Revolution, disappearing from international events he had once dominated. But ping-pong diplomacy rehabilitated him, and he served as China's Minister of Sport and Physical Culture, only then to find himself charged with being allied with Mao's discredited wife in the Gang of Four plot and jailed again. Upon learning of Cowan's death, Zhuang wanted to know how Americans had reacted. In fact, no news outlet beyond the table tennis world carried an obituary. When Zhuang dies, he pointed out, everyone in China will know. Indeed, 6 weeks ago, Zhuang's death was worldwide news. So you have this irony. In the individualistic society that mints celebrities to worship them, Cowan was forgotten. In collectivist China, where to be 1 in a million is to live among 1,000 more just like you, Zhuang, by his death, was fully rehabilitated and heralded as a man who forever changed the course of history. Ever the diplomat, Zhuang in 2006 hosted several American players and officials, as well as Fran Cowan, Glenn's mother, on a 35th anniversary return visit to China. And at dinner the last evening, the group sang a karaoke version of Let It Be in Glenn's honor. The U.S. team's tour and the Chinese team's return visit a year later would be triumphs of stagecraft in the service of statecraft, captivating the press and public as they advanced the interests of both nations. And in his memoir, White House Years, Henry Kissinger refers to the Chinese knack for making the meticulously planned appear spontaneous. And the invitation to the U.S. team, he says, was carefully planned. Only Mao could have ordered this, and only Zhao Enlai could have orchestrated it. But if the accounts to emerge from China over the past few decades are to be believed, 2 people thrown together by chance drove the process. For this story, I spoke with Henry Kissinger, and I asked him if he knew the story of the American athlete who had inadvertently boarded the Chinese team bus. Henry Kissinger told me that he did not. You, good audience, now know more about ping-pong diplomacy than Henry Kissinger does. So, I haven't had my head at CNN much in the last 48 hours, but apparently this is a fairly relevant topic. Here we have Dennis Rodman and Kim Jong-un a few weeks ago, I guess. A few months ago? Probably about 6 weeks ago in Pyongyang. As the Los Angeles Times immortally asked in a headline, what could possibly go wrong? And I must say it was not a promising sign that en route to North Korea, Rodman tweeted out, "Hope to meet Gangnam-style dude while I'm here." History records that Tsai helpfully tweeted back, "I'm in South, man." Yet, how hermetic is the hermit kingdom, really, if its ruler knows of Dennis Rodman and wants to receive him and seems to be having a rip-roaring good time with him? The point is, connections between nations, including history-altering connections, are sometimes made in unexpected ways and at commonplace levels. And just as ping-pong diplomacy began with a friendship born of a chance encounter between 2 athletes, human interaction at the one-on-one level really does matter. That's one of the reasons I wanted to personalize my remarks this evening, to share with you my dealings with people like Svetislav Pesic and Archie Cunningham. And that's why any one of you, perhaps motivated by Kevin Dugan or Laura Thomas or Ben Gucciardi or Dee Malkow or any of the others around the Borah workshops this week, perhaps they could change this world one person at a time. I'll leave you with these words from a man who had a prophet's understanding of the power of sport, and who, by reaching out to another, helped secure the course of history, if not outright change it. Thank you so very much for the opportunity to speak to you this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A number of things. First of all, as a history professor, I'm very happy to see somebody can do something with their history major. I now have an answer to the question, why major in history? Okay, we now are going to have questions, but before we do, what I'd like to remind you is tomorrow we have 2 more sessions of the Borah. From 10 o'clock until, I believe, 2, we have the workshops that that Alex has been able to tell you about. I strongly urge you to go. It's hands-on. A lot of college education is just listening to people like me talk. And therefore, to be able to go to these workshops, I strongly encourage you to do so. As far as, again, and then tomorrow evening in this very same place, we have the very high honor and privilege of hearing Johan Olof Koss, who will be our keynote speaker, the 4-time Olympic champion, and founder of Right to Play. So we're going to, I believe we have, do we have a microphone? Yes, no? Okay, on the sides, they're on the sides. Line up and on one side or the other. And that's right, thank you for the lights. And we'll take as many questions as Alex wishes to answer. So please, I hand this back to you. Okay, and you can choose.
You can also ask what's Charles Barkley really like if you want. It doesn't have to be about war and peace. Yes, Aziz, thank you.
Hi, Alex. I wondered if you have had a chance to cover test matches between India and Pakistan. The reason I ask is during and leading up to the test matches for about 4 weeks, there is a sense of real tranquility between the two countries. And 2 weeks after the 5-day matches, it's just really a calm period. So I wondered if you had a chance to cover that.
I've never covered cricket. I'm terribly embarrassed to say. But I'm fascinated that there's the calm before the storm, and then the storm rages after the matches are over. As I'm trying to think, that's not really par for the course in other sports. I mean, certainly the soccer war we touched on there, it seemed like it was all kind of build-up, and the soccer game was the climax. And then people had to come and clean up the mess. But yes, cricket also has, and that's, there were so many possible places to go with this. I tried to confine it to the sports and the particular examples that I was hands-on familiar with, but cricket and the India-Pakistan question is one of real abiding conflict and is well worth studying, no question.
Hey. I thank you for that great talk. It was wonderful. Can you speak a bit about your relationship with the photographers that you travel with? We noticed some great photographs in some of the articles that you showed, and there was some video work that was done with the documentaries. So what's that relationship like if you're crafting a story, or if you're working on a story and figuring out the people you want to highlight, or are there particular people that you keep working with when you're doing that?
I'm so glad you asked that. The kinds of stories that I spoke about tonight are ones in which I must work really closely with photographers. And there have been maybe 3 or 4 that I've found myself working with most often. A 360-pound Englishman with really red hair. I went through China with a couple times, and believe me, he was a curiosity. On some stories, you want to be as inconspicuous as possible, and on others, it helps to kind of let the word out that you're in town. And traveling with Bob Martin, the Englishman, he's sort of his own advance party, if you get my drift, but he's really hardworking and great company. But probably the most relevant example I could share tonight is there's a photographer named Lynn Johnson I've worked with, and she lives in Pittsburgh. She's tiny, and really self-effacing personality. And I went with her to Iran to do a story about women in sports there. Because they have such strict rules on the hijab, it's very difficult for women to compete in sports as we would recognize competing in sports. And the daughter of the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, a guy named Rafsanjani, who got a lot of publicity back in the days of the Iranian Revolution, is something of a feminist as far as feminism goes in Iran, in that she passionately believes in the right of Iranian women to play sports. So she created something called the Islamic Women's Games, which essentially allows women to do anything they want to do because men are totally banned from observing. And I somehow scored an interview with her to talk about this, because the Iranians, I was doing a story about the countries that haven't sent women to the Olympics, or have sent very few, and I went to Uruguay, Botswana, and Iran. I went to Uruguay because machismo was kind of interfering with the effort to send women, and I went to Botswana because HIV/AIDS, quite frankly, was wiping out women who might be eligible to go. But Iran, they were sending pistol shooters because they could be absolutely still under the hijab and still fire the pistol. So upshot is, Lynn and I go there, and I've never felt male privilege more intensely than to go to Iran with a woman who has to be covered the whole time, and a photographer who has to be covered the whole time. I mean, imagine trying to do your job wearing the veil. But there was a wonderful moment where Lynn was able to play a trump card, and that was when we went to see Rafsanjani's daughter. And Rafsanjani's daughter invited Lynn in to her home. And Lynn told me later she let her hair down. They both let their hair down. She was wearing jeans under her hijab. And Lynn didn't come back and dish all that much for my story. That's not the kind of session that they had. But during our 5 days in Tehran, Lynn was able to leverage her self-effacement and her small stature to take some really extraordinary pictures. Lynn does great work in black and white. For whatever reason, it seems to fit her personality and her style. And whether you're finding her work in National Geographic or you find it in back issues of SI, I highly recommend it. She's really terrific at what she does. Thanks, Laura, for asking. We got one more? Okay. And then the hour's late. I'll let y'all go.
I was just curious, in connection with that wonderful film clip by the Hoop Dreams people about the breakup of the friendships, those intense friendships from the former Yugoslav national team. And it was almost heartbreaking to see their dejection in talking about what had happened. And you didn't get much hope from the film clip, but from what you know more broadly, do you think there's any chance in the future of basketball playing some significant role in healing the wounds and building bridges in the former Yugoslavia?
I do. In the 10 years or so immediately after the end of the conflict, it was still really dodgy over there. And the Serb areas within Bosnia had kind of consolidated and were pouring a lot of their resentments into the club teams there, and it wasn't a happy atmosphere at all. But I do think this is one of those, we've seen it a little bit in Ireland, where the prosperity, the chance to be kind of part of Western Europe starts to make people almost too comfortable to dwell on the past. And then you have, in sports anyway, you have a younger generation that pushes through that because of globalization and mass media, isn't drawing real bright lines between the Croat or the Serb who's playing in the NBA. It's just somebody from the Balkans. Not unlike that 12-year-old Palestinian girl who talked about Omri Kaspi, the Israeli, and how, he was her neighbor, basically. So I think it's been a process. It was a real halting one. Anybody who was in the former Yugoslavia in the 5 to 10 years immediately after the conflict will tell you just how nasty the atmosphere was, and that extended to sports. But I do think that there's promise there. We're never going to see a united Yugoslav team again. And Teo Alibegovic, who was the guy who opened and ended the film, who was lingering over those photographs, that was his dream. He was really the idealist, and we wanted to feature him in telling the story because he was so gauzy-eyed about it. And really, he made the case to me about how they could have beaten the dream team in '92. If this hadn't happened, we would have gone to Barcelona and we would have played a zone, and those NBA stars had never seen a zone before, and we shoot well, and we make a few three-pointers, and suddenly they won't know what to do. And he's probably dreaming his little dream, but basketball is a dream game, and let him have his little delusion. But I do think that there is some promise there if we have a long time horizon to fix to it. So thank you so much for sticking with me. I know it was a lengthy evening, but this is too important. Oh, I'm sorry, one more, yes.
Yeah,
this is too important a subject to gloss over.
Yeah, I just have one quick question.
Yeah.
You kind of mentioned some examples where sports were kind of divisive or where they were really positive. I was just wondering, based on your insight, what could make sporting events or these competitions a positive thing and not something that's going to divide people?
Yeah, well, I happen to be a believer in the Olympics. I do think that there are all sorts of noxious things about them and the way they're administered and how much they cost and the way they're misused and abused. But I do think there's something really exciting happening right now, and I wrote about it the last week of these London Olympics. I wrote about social media and how they had kind of ruled the London Olympics. And I think this is enormously exciting, and I was mentioning it to Ellen Cattell earlier today. Everybody was bitching and moaning about NBC's coverage, but they were doing it while watching NBC, and they were griping on their second screen. They were tweeting or Facebooking how angry they were at NBC for not letting us see what we wanted to see. So people were absorbing the NBC coverage, and then they were doing this with their community. And even more exciting, at 4 a.m., Usain Bolt is tweeting out a picture of himself in the Olympic Village with the Swedish handball team in his room. And he's tweeting it. All you have to do is follow Usain Bolt, and he's sharing his social life with you. So Usain Bolt is no longer representing Jamaica. He's like your guy. He's in your social circle. And I think it's that we're getting into, the national barriers that are the root of so many of the things that we talked about tonight that were negative, as you point out. Those things are dropping away and getting forced out by something, frankly, that's threatening the future of journalists. I mean, why does an athlete need to go through a journalist when he has something to say when he can reach his 1 million Twitter followers in an instant? But I think that's enormously exciting. I think it's great for international understanding. I mean, if we regard Usain Bolt as our countryman, even though he's a Jamaican, but as our fellow human, I think we're already taking a huge step toward a much more positive way of relating with one another. So to answer your question, it's not necessarily something in the rules of the game or the circumstances in the arena that will lead to a more positive experience. I think it's just this ability to kind of share in a network that's infinitely interconnected, that's so enormously popular. And efforts by the IOC or agents or whomever to try to tamp this down, in the end, are doomed, because people, be they athletes or not, are going to find their ways to connect with the people they want to connect with. And it's the arrow of history.
Okay.
Thank you so much.